Hello, book lovers. Hello, people curious about the world. Welcome back to Bookish. We're your virtual hangout for author conversations and big ideas. I'm your host, Sam Dunn. Bookish is, as always, brought to you by the Southern California New. Yeah, sure. Bookish is brought to you by the Southern California News Group and the Bay Area News Group, and now also by the San Diego Union Tribune. Yay! Welcome everyone from America's finest city. We're glad to have you. Everything we do is made possible by subscribers who support local journalism. So if you are a subscriber, thank you, thank you, thank you. And by the way, if you are a subscriber attending tonight, you are automatically entered to win a $50 gift card from Arvida Books in Tustin, California. And let me see, I have scrolled past the winner and I know that's on the screen, but let me see, it is Marsha Lee Harris. Marsha, congratulations. And listen, if you don't subscribe to any local news yet, here's your chance. On Yeah, sure. Boy, something's up with me tonight. Sorry, guys. Go to one of the websites on the screen here to find your local paper anywhere throughout Southern California and Northern California and San Diego. Get a subscription and find out how good it feels to be a stakeholder in local news. And another thing, if you really love repping your status as a bookworm, also check out our bookish swag. As always, if you have questions during the program that you want me to see, hit the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. But if you just want to chime in or talk to your fellow viewers, use the chat. And don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. You'll be sent a link to the full program, and you can also find it at scng.com/virtual events and on YouTube. So today, guys, this is a great show I'm so excited about. It's my absolute thrill to welcome two extraordinary journalists with two very different but equally enthralling books. So be warned, today's show is going to be a lot longer than usual because really there is so much to cover. Okay. So first up, we're taking a hard look at a company many of us once trusted without question. My guest is Gardiner Harris, an award-winning journalist who has worked for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Over the years, he's covered everything from the FDA and pharmaceutical industries to the White House to foreign affairs as a South Asia correspondent. Now in his New York Times bestselling book, No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson, he brings that same investigative rigor to uncover how a household name has actually endangered our lives. Gardner, I am so thrilled to have you here. I can't even tell you.
I'm so glad to be here. And I just want to say up front that I had nothing to do with Marsha Harris winning today. Like,
Nothing,
not,
sure.
I'm not related. She's not a cousin. I just
Sure,
want
it's
to be absolutely
full
careful.
transparency. A good
Yeah,
journalist, full
yeah.
transparency. To be fair, my mother's last name was Harris as well, so there's
We
no
need to
inside
get that
job.
out there. Yeah.
We need Listen, I was handed your book by a friend of mine who pressed it into my hand and said, "You have to read this." And as soon as I did, I felt like everybody in the world needs to read this book. But before we get into the specific details, I have to say what drew you to investigate Johnson & Johnson has to be one of the most incredible examples of serendipity I have ever heard. You detail it in the book's intro, but if you can for our viewers, please talk about that fateful random airport conversation you had and how it sparked this whole thing.
Well, sure. And again, thanks for having me. I think if there are a lot of journalists on this call, I think they will recognize this. I can't tell you the number of stories that I have gotten over the course of my career by one of these happenstance conversations. I was in Chicago O'Hare Airport for one of those long layovers that anyone who flies United has
Knows about.
done many, many times.
Yeah.
And I was looking for a place to rest my weary feet. I was just coming back from a ski vacation. And I had worked for the Louisville Courier Journal, and I had become a big college basketball fan while serving in Kentucky. And particularly, I had been the Hazard correspondent, so I covered the eastern third of the state, and they are crazy about basketball. So, anyway, the March Madness was on. I wanted to watch it. I sat down and did so. And the woman next to me had a Mississippi State ball cap on. Mississippi State was playing. They were, by the time I got there, it was just the end of the first half. Mississippi State was up big. And then over the course of the second half, they collapsed and lost to what was then the sort of Cinderella team. And she was, of course, crushed. And if not for those circumstances, might not have told me this story about how she was a Johnson and Johnson sales rep, and um, she was selling Risperdal, their antipsychotic, and was detailing it to child psychiatrists for whom it was not approved. So
Mm,
her entire job was illegal, which didn't seem to bother her until um, her nephew got in a fight. And in order for her nephew to continue in that school, the school required him to go seek counseling. She got him
mm,
an appointment with her favorite psychiatrist, and to her shock and amazement, the psychiatrist prescribed the very
Jesus.
Risperdal that she was detailing. Um,
Mm,
and very quickly, he got incredibly obese, and she watched this disaster unfold in her family right before her very eyes. And it made her obviously question what she was doing for a living, and she was about to
yeah.
quit. I asked for her full name, and I wanted to do a story about it. And she left my card on the bar, and I never saw her again. I ended up doing a series of stories about the use of antipsychotics in children as a result. She really put that issue uppermost in my mind. Those stories came out in the New York Times. Ended up doing a series actually that led to a Senate investigation that then eventually led to the Physician Payment Sunshine Act getting passed in Congress. So it it didn't. I mean, it was a productive conversation, but it also dovetailed with a series of other things that were going on in my life that made me realize that Johnson and Johnson, I was covering all of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah,
I knew
industry.
all of these
Well,
CEOs.
well, that's what's incredible. Just if yeah, serendipity works for all of us reporters, but
But
the fact that you were this particularly skilled in this field, and for her to tell you that story, I thought was just incredible. Anyway, so please go ahead.
Well, anyway, I mean, this
Anyway,
book is not a big pharma book. It's a Johnson and Johnson book, and I sort of
yeah,
emphasize that because I actually think there are some pretty good companies out there, and I thought that at the time. It's just what I discovered over the course of, as you know, as so many of your listeners know, you come into a beat with a bunch of
yeah,
expectations that invariably are dead wrong. Like when I was a cop reporter in Louisville, I thought as I came in, there were the good guys were over here, the bad guys were over here. I
yeah,
ended up getting that exactly wrong, and ended up as a result doing an investigation that led to the indictment of the police chief. But like on the pharma beat, I had grown up in Princeton, New Jersey, near Johnson and
yeah.
Johnson's
I,
headquarters.
I was going to mention this. Yeah, you dovetail with this company interestingly throughout your life. Anyway,
Right. And I thought they were the greatest because that was their reputation. I mean, on the sidelines of my football games when I was a kid and my, swim meets were these red cursive logos of Johnson and Johnson. And the families were really proud of this connection because of
yeah,
the sense that Johnson and Johnson sort of combined the best of American capitalism, that you could do good for the country and the world, and you could do well financially, right? And so when I came into the beat, I assumed they would be by far and away the most open and the most honest. And I found just the opposite. And it's really, that was 26 years ago. I really started that. And it was
wow,
those sort of myriad discoveries. And I would say the most emotional one was my son was born early. He ended up spending my oldest son, who just went off on a jog, he ended up spending 4 days in the NICU, which were among the
mm,
worst 4 days of my life.
sure,
And back then, of course, fathers didn't get any leave. And I went, as soon as he came home, I went straight back to work. And within days, got this tranche of documents from a source that detailed how Johnson and Johnson had illegally sold this heartburn drug Propulsid to babies. And they were so successful that one fifth of all preemie infants in NICUs across the country were prescribed this drug, despite two crucial facts. One, Johnson & Johnson had undertaken 20 separate clinical trials in children, all of which had failed. So they knew conclusively that this drug was not didn't help. And two, this drug had this deadly side effect of QT prolongation, which is basically a heart murmur, which in preemies is particularly problematic. As you know, preemies are
Yeah.
holding on to life by gossamer threads. And so there was this pile of dead babies that had gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and Johnson and Johnson continued this illegal sales campaign nonetheless. And in the emails back and forth that I got in this tranche of documents, secret documents, there was a conversation amongst Johnson and Johnson employees, like, what are we doing here? We're killing babies. Should we be doing that? And the response was, this is what we need to do for the company. And I was, having just had my own child in a NICU unit, I was floored. Like, I literally could not
Eh,
believe it. And
Yeah.
so that had happened, this sales rep, and this other thing,
It's
which sort of had started it, which was when I first came to the beat, any of us of a certain age will remember that the big controversy at the turn of the century was AIDS in Africa. And
hmm
the fact that American pharmaceutical companies had come up with these amazing drugs called antiretrovirals that basically turned AIDS from a deadly killer to a chronic disease
into
was amazing. But here was Africa. The infection was spreading across the continent like wildfire, and they couldn't afford the drug. So, after a huge Sturm and Drang and cry, the industry finally agreed to license these drugs to Indian generic makers so that those companies could make cheap versions that could be distributed across the continent. And
Mhm.
once the price got below $1 a day for this cocktail of three medicines, we knew that the continent would be saved. And everybody was happy, everybody participated, except Johnson and Johnson. Johnson and Johnson was the only major manufacturer of AIDS drugs that refused to provide them.
refused to. Yeah.
Refused this most ethical and essential practice. And I just was
Yeah.
like, wait, how is
What?
this
How is?
possible?
Let
Yeah,
me tell it's just the amount of things you uncover with egregious consequences for public health are just it's just mind-boggling. We've got talcum powder that causes cancer, cancer drugs that grow cancer tumors larger, Tylenol, which I didn't realize how incredibly dangerous a drug that is, the
yeah,
complicity in the opioid. I mean, I'm reading from a list because I knew I couldn't keep it all in my head. Complicity in the opioid epidemic through its fentanyl patch and its COVID vaccine and its dangerous side effects that help create what we're now seeing as the anti-vaccine sentiment. I mean, it just blew my mind.
yeah.
And and
Never,
which
never mind metal on metal hip
never
implants,
never
vaginal
oh
mesh,
my God,
all that stuff.
the vaginal mesh, everything. I mean,
And
what
one of the
but
things
there's
that one of the things that as journalists that really concerns me is, and you know this, Sam, from reading it, like during the heart of the prescription opioid crisis, we're now in
yeah.
the Mexican fentanyl crisis, but in the early days,
hmm
like about 10% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system, from the
hmm
Sackler family.
hmm
60% had a J&J product in their system. So
Yeah.
we as journalists have been telling this story about the opioid crisis that is
As the
just
Sackler story.
basically wrong. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not a Sackler story. It's a
Yeah.
J&J story. And one of the questions, and look, we all have worked for these organizations. They are flawed. I tried to do this story multiple times at the New York Times, uh, couldn't for a variety of reasons.
hmm
And,
hmm
why? Why do we all believe that Purdue Pharma, and why are all the TV pieces about that, the movies, the books, why do they all focus on Purdue Pharma and not on the actual, most important company in that crisis, J&J? Well, you know what? the Purdue Pharma was this tiny one product company. It was an easy target. Johnson and
Mhm.
Johnson is the vital
It's
company of the entire, like they have,
healthcare system.
yeah,
Yes.
they have
They've,
consultants in every single major medical
yeah.
center. They, by the way, fund many of the journalistic operations that we work for, right? They have among the
Hmm.
largest advertising budgets
Hmm.
anywhere because of all their consumer products. So
Hmm.
you get to see just how successful a powerful organization like Johnson and Johnson can be in keeping itself out of trouble.
Yeah. Let me I have my own questions, but I want to pay attention to one of our viewers. Patricia Polar
Please. Yeah.
says, Gardner, having listened to your book right now, listening at chapter 18, I'm shocked that no one has been held criminally accountable for these deaths, maiming, and uh, lives changed throughout the country and worldwide. I mean, we've just enumerated some of the things she talks about. Your thoughts? She wants to know your thoughts about Kennedy at the CDC now and the mistrust of whatever the CDC represents. How are these things related
So two
in your
thoughts.
mind, if they are?
Yeah. One of the, and I detail this as you know in the book. I got
Right.
a bunch of grand jury files, right? And I
That's what I was going to say. You bring the receipts. Everyone,
right.
the receipts are here in the book. It's incredible. Anyway, go ahead.
So,
Sorry.
I was a White House correspondent for the New York Times, which, kind of
Yeah.
many people kind of see as the top of the profession. And we got national security documents relatively,
Hmm.
regularly. And as you know,
Hmm.
they appear in bathrooms at Mar-a-Lago and in garages in Wilmington, Delaware.
Delaware.
But what never shows up in any of these places, and as far as I know, no journalistic organization has had access to these documents in decades, are grand jury files. Grand juries are the last truly secret American institution. Like, again, as far as I know, the New York Times has not had a single grand jury file in 50 years, nor has the Wall Street Journal or any other major media organization. I have hundreds of them. And that's because my sources were so frustrated by the very question that your person is raising. Um, why weren't any of these people held accountable? And part of the reason is that it would have been difficult. It would have required a lot of work on the part of prosecutors. The other reason, as I point out, Sam, in the book, is that
Hmm.
most of these prosecutors ended up going to work for
Go
Johnson and
do
Johnson.
work for Johnson and Johnson. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
And again, this is the difference between Johnson and Johnson on the one hand and the Sacklers. The Sacklers, three of the top executives for the Sacklers ended up getting prosecuted. The prosecutors themselves wanted to charge them with felonies after Mary Jo White, a former U.S. attorney in New York, called Maine Justice. Maine Justice then called the prosecutors in Virginia and told them to downgrade those charges from felonies to misdemeanors. So while they were prosecuted, the prosecutors themselves were frustrated that they didn't get felonies. But having said that, Purdue Pharma did not have the juice to entirely get rid of these charges. Johnson and Johnson had the juice. And these prosecutors, as I detail lay out their reasoning for not going after these people. And it would be too hard. And that they all then, or three of the four, end up going to
Mhm.
work for Johnson and Johnson, is never mentioned because they must have been calculating the odds. Like, if I go after these individuals,
Right.
my career chances post government are significantly harmed. And that's how Johnson and Johnson has managed to get away with this. And the other story, as you know, Sam, that I tell is that Johnson and Johnson ended up saving the FDA in 2012. The
Yes.
commissioner of the FDA reached out directly to Johnson and Johnson to try to get them get the company to help with the FDA's budget. The company then did help. And in the months after that, the FDA took incredibly easy action on a whole series of Johnson and Johnson disasters, saving Johnson and Johnson billions upon billions in subsequent liability. So again, this company is at the center of the American healthcare system, at the center of the American political system, and at the center of the American justice system. And that's why they've been able to do this again and again and again and again, almost without consequence.
It's such a massive story. I wish we had the whole hour just to talk to you, Gardner. I'm serious. I mean, I'll have to have you come back on because uh, I could just talk about this all day. But unfortunately, we do have limited time.
Yay.
Um, I wanted to ask a more personal question for everyone in the audience. Please get this book. Please get this book as if your life depended on it because it just might.
Oh, that's nice of
Um,
you.
um, but the story is so dark. You do an amazing job of creating a compelling narrative. You go into history. You balance so many factors. I thought so well. I was very envious of your ability. But Gardner, how did you survive writing this? What was the process like for you? You wrote it. It took you over 5 years, didn't it, to actually write the book?
It did. I was a cop reporter back in the day, and a lot of cop reporters end up either having to get off the beat because it just destroys them too much. I spoke to the families of murder victims probably twice a week in that job. Um, and it was really hard. And you get kind of a
Mm.
PTSD when you're a cop
Yeah.
reporter. I think a bunch of people on this podcast will know that because they've been cop
Mhm.
reporters themselves. And I think
Mhm.
this writing this book was sort of very similar to being a cop reporter. You end up living with a lot of really difficult, hard stories because, of course, part of my job was finding the families who were victimized by these many, many illegal actions on the part of Johnson and Johnson and um, their, I mean, for me, the difficult thing, and people often ask me, was I can't really explain what went on within the company. What I could never get in, obviously, to the heads of these executives. Um, and I really struggled with how do people really look at themselves. And Sam,
Mhm.
as you know, one of the extraordinary things about the book was, again, how stupid I was going into the beat. I came into the beat thinking there was this moral hierarchy in the industry, and that, the researchers in the industry were really, to a person good. They were just trying to cure diseases. The executives
Right.
were maybe in the middle, and the worst were the sales reps, who would do anything to sell a drug. And I came out of the beat with the exact opposite hierarchy. And that really shows in the book. The researchers, the most educated people, could calculate down to the decimal point the number of people who would die as a result of their actions. And the sales reps really didn't know much about this, but it was universally the sales reps who blew the whistle on these things. It was
Yeah.
never the most educated people, never the executives. And so I came away with this sense that there was almost this inverse proportion, inverse relationship between education and morality. And the really true kind of salt of the earth people were the ones who eventually sort of said, I can't live with this.
Can't live with
And
doing
and
this
so
every day.
that at the end was sort of cheering for me that there were some people who really tried to stop this. And and they were, they were the ones at the bottom of the chain.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so just two more questions and then I
Yeah.
will I will let you go, but I
Yeah.
promise I want to have you back somehow. Um, so after spending years investigating and writing, what do you hope readers carry away from this? Not just about the company itself, but about more broadly the question of corporate responsibility and consumer trust. Um, what do we take?
First of all, I think these mission statements, these corporate mission statements, I mean, Johnson and Johnson is the original maker of a corporate mission statement, what they call their credo. I think actually can cover up and lead to really bad behavior. I think it's utter nonsense, these things,
Mm,
and
mm,
we need to get out of making them. Second, you know, I wrote the book really so that people can protect themselves and their families. There are 9 separate products in very different parts of the healthcare system. And what I hope you see is that there are all these interests that are against your interests as a patient. Like, the story about EPO, the cancer medicine that actually made tumors grow.
make grow.
Oncology is one of the most corrupt forms of medicine because oncologists serve as both doctor and pharmacist, and they make most of their money actually from their drug markups. So they have extraordinary interest in prescribing to you the most expensive medicines and prescribing them until your death. And you know, one of these facts that I'd love to tell people is guess how long the average patient at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer or MD Anderson spends on hospice care. And people usually guess, 4 or 5 months, and it's actually
Months.
18 hours. And that's not because the patients want this. That's almost certainly because the doctors themselves, they don't make any money on you when you stop taking these incredibly expensive, tough cancer
Drugs.
medicines. And the same thing is true in orthopedics. Orthopedics is the most corrupt form of medicine. A huge share of orthopedic surgeons have consulting arrangements with device makers. So I want, these are people who often win the Humanitarian of the Year award. And in that story about EPO, again, I have the grand jury documents. Everyone in cancer was in on this disaster, one that cost 500,000 lives and one that you've never heard of and no one else has ever heard of. Why is that? Why don't you know any of these stories? I mean,
Mm.
books generally are supposed to tell you stories in a little bit more detail that you already know. I think what's been difficult about this book is that nobody knows this story. And why?
My husband asked me that question earlier when I was raving about this book, and he said, "Why have I not heard about any of this?" And I said, "Well, there's a big story behind it. So,
Right.
but it's out now, and we can make the choice to read it and to press it into other people's hands." I have to let you go, but before I let you go, I have to ask, what are you working on now? I mean, I know that you once wrote a novel. Are you going to turn to fiction? Is that going to be a relief? What's going on
Yeah.
with you?
No, I've got another book in my future. Unfortunately, I've been busy with a few other things, but
Mhm.
yeah, I think I'm probably going to stick with healthcare. I did do politics and White House and all that sort of stuff, but I find healthcare such a great story again for the reporters.
Sure.
It has all the money, it has life and death stories,
Yeah.
it has pathos in it. I think the healthcare beat is endlessly fascinating, and it's 18% of our GDP. We spend more on it than we spend on anything else. As you said, RFK is in charge of 25% of the federal budget, which is twice as much as Pete Hegseth at defense, right? There is
Yeah.
no place more important. And it's always kind of amazing to me that at the Times had like one person covering HHS and had 10 covering the
10
Pentagon,
covering.
even though, HHS spends twice as much. I think it's a really important story and we need to
Yeah.
keep working on it.
Well, I'm glad. I have to tell you, when I was diagnosed with a chronic illness myself, I have Parkinson's. I
Sorry.
realized that's okay. It's actually okay. Of all the crappy things you can have, Parkinson's is probably the least crappy. Um, but it made me profoundly aware of the complexity of this system that you are taking on. So thank you for your work.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me and for being enthusiastic about the book. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's really a pleasure. Everyone, No More Tears, The Dark Secrets of Johnson and Johnson, Gardner Harris. Gardner, thank you so much. Well, everybody, I hope you are illuminated and inspired by that, and a little scared too. So now it's my pleasure to share with you my conversation with Susan Orlean. She's a person I'm lucky enough to know who just happens to be one of the most celebrated voices in American nonfiction. You might know her from The Orchid Thief, which inspired the film adaptation starring Meryl Streep and Nick Cage, and her deeply reported bestseller, The Library Book, and others. She's a longtime staff writer for The New Yorker and a storyteller with an eye for the quirky and the profound and the unforgettable. And now, in her new memoir, Joyride, for the first time, Susan turns that lens on her own life, and she takes us along for a ride that's as surprising as her journalism. Joyride drops on October 14th, but we had a little preview conversation, she and I. It was a long conversation. So without further ado, let's roll. Julie, can you start the interview? Welcome, my friend Susan Orlean, to Bookish. I am so thrilled to have you.
I am delighted to be with you and to
Oh
talk
my,
to you.
oh my gosh. Okay, let me just show you. I showed you before we started, but let me just show you again what I've done to this book. I love this. Look at what I've done to this book so far. This is
Oh
just
my
so far.
God.
I had to give up turning things down and highlighting because I was highlighting every damn page. Susan, you are the reluctant memoirist. You say this many times in the book that you never intended to write a memoir. Uh, so why this? Why now?
I had been toying with the idea of writing a book about writing, but part of me felt like that was very pedantic and boring. I just didn't know how to write a book about writing that wouldn't feel textbook like. So I thought I can maybe I'll take one of my stories and dissect it. My decision was to take American Man Age 10 and just sort of unpack it and show how the sausage was made. And I thought that I can do. But it made no sense out of context.
Right.
And so
And
as
that's in fact the chapter you begin with. You begin doing that, but then,
yeah, and then I thought in a void, this doesn't have the impact that I really feel it needs to have. And as I drew the camera back further and further, suddenly I'm in my childhood bedroom. There was another thing that was going on, which is that it was COVID. And during COVID, I really think most people got very ruminative and thinking about what mattered and what was meaningful in our lives.
yeah, what's it all about, Alfie? I mean, really, we're sitting here maybe at the end of history. So what does it mean?
Exactly. And what have I done and what's been important to me? It made me take stock in a way that I'd never really felt entitled to do before that. Because honestly, I thought, who wants to read my memoir? Like, who cares? And well, there's
Me
one.
and millions, thousands, if not millions of other people. So anyway, continue on.
But
So
I do think it's appropriate that I wasn't dying to write a memoir. My whole kind of ethos as a writer has been to go out and explore, to learn about the things I don't know about, to take people to subcultures and situations that they wouldn't experience otherwise. And that included me. What is a world in which I'm going to fumble around and try to understand? So it felt peculiar to turn the lens on myself, where I thought, what's the exploration here? I know myself, of course, who knows themselves? But there, I felt that my strength has always been to be pretty fearless about looking into unexamined worlds.
yes, yes.
So this felt uh, like just out of my, universe of what I write about.
It's interesting. You mentioned that your stories, you have two types of stories. I don't have it in front of me. The wow, did you know about this? And what was the other one?
Well, one I always call hiding in plain sight,
Hiding in plain sight.
and
Exactly.
and the other is who knew. Um,
Yes.
because, and those are not somewhat inelegant ways of describing those two emotions. One is something that's right in front of you that you've just never stopped and thought about. That feels very, very familiar, but in fact, it's not so familiar if you think about it. And the other is the discovery of a subculture or a passion or a place or some aspect of life that you never even knew existed, and having the urge to say, let me find out about this and let me tell you about it.
What I loved is that I felt that this book did both of those things. Susan hiding in plain sight, because really when you look at your career, when you look at the stellar work you've done, from The Orchid Thief to The Library Book to Rin Tin Tin to all of the other amazing pieces that you have done, we're really looking at the autobiography of Susan's mind and her obsessions. It's been a lifetime of that. And you've kind of been hiding in plain sight, but then you look into your own life and look into the motivations of your life. And I found it really fascinating to explore some of the aspects of growing up. You mentioned that your parents were not the closest of couples, and you developed the skill of listening and not being seen, and that served you well in your career. You
Yes, so that the optimist in me wants very much to always see the good that comes out of something challenging. And my parents had a very fractious relationship. It was difficult I mean, they stayed married for millions of years, but with a lot of turmoil.
yeah.
And it taught me some not good lessons, but it also taught me, um, I became a listener and an observer. I and something of a detective, actually, trying to figure out what are they arguing about? Why are they arguing? What's the underlying issue here? Those are the either I became a writer because I was good at that, or I became good at that.
Okay.
It's hard to tell which is the chicken
Yeah.
and which is the egg, but that capacity to observe and study is something that I think emerged early for me.
It seemed to, and two other aspects I thought were really fascinating from writing about your childhood. Your dad always reminding you that you and um,
Brother and sister.
your brother and sister, that's correct. What am I saying? That's correct for? It's not a quiz. It's your life.
I
Um,
accept
but
the brother and the sister.
and the brother and the sister. But him taking you to different parts of the city to impoverished parts of your city, and saying this is how the other half lives, essentially, and making you aware that it was a privilege, really, to be in the life that you had, and making you aware of what else was happening in the United States and happening in your very own community.
My dad was an amazing person at a time when that was not the typical behavior of a suburban upper middle class father. At that time, it was all about white flight, and I grew up in Cleveland, and Cleveland had a lot of
Shaker.
civil unrest when I was a kid. And it would have been very easy to live my whole life just in Shaker Heights, my beautiful hometown, and literally never go into the city of Cleveland. My parents just were not, that was not okay for them. They were very proud of being from Cleveland. They embraced it as the entirety of the city. They lived obviously a very privileged life, a very comfortable life, but they never made an effort to say, look the other way, kids.
Yeah.
That stuff is upsetting and not pretty and don't look there. And my father took it one step further. As I wrote in the book, he not in any sort of weird sadistic way, but when after the civil unrest in Cleveland and things were sort of simmering down, he said, we're going to go drive around and see the neighborhoods where this was going on to, I think, kind of understand it. He did not grow up wealthy.
Yeah.
But it was more than that. It was really a feeling of, number one, of interest and curiosity. What is going on in the world? As opposed to what I feel has happened over the last 50 or 100 years in this country is a kind of turning inward. I don't want to see the things that jostle my identity. I only am comfortable with what's familiar. And I feel strongly like that is a corrosive, truly debilitating attitude, and one that has led to a lot of the problems that we have in this country.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think you underline that beautifully without creating a lecture in your work. You underline that beautifully. And one of the other elements, and then I promise we'll move on from childhood, but I was just intrigued by everything you wrote about growing up. One of the other elements I thought was so beautiful is what is the lesson you took from your Jewish faith. And that is the idea that every person contains worlds. Can you talk about that a little bit? I loved that. And I thought it was, once I understood that, I was so reflective of everything in your work.
It's a really beautiful aspect of the Talmud that it can be read in both directions, which is that each person contains an entire story, an entire world, that the world is filled with people, but each person is a universe. And often it's in application to the idea of losing someone, and this was very much, it was in the Talmud, but it arose in the Holocaust a great deal, which was, think of all the worlds we lost in all the people that we lost, that each one was so full of possibility and stories and memories and capacity. And I think, in a way, it's a spiritual attitude that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It's a way of valuing each individual as having a huge presence in the universe. No matter who they are, no matter how small their world might appear from the outside, they are a huge universe. I've never found that not to be true. I mean, it is kind of the way I move through the world.
It's all over your body of work. You take the everyday and elevate the everyday into the spectacular. It's something I've always admired and tried to emulate, frankly, in my own work. And understanding the root of that was really powerful to me, just personally as one reader.
Oh, it's wonderful, because it really is a way of engaging in life that's about valuing everyone and seeing the dignity in the whole spectrum of human existence. And to me, it's almost like saying, welcome to the candy store. Just think, if every person is really interesting and has a wonderful story, wow, we are living in a world of literally billions of wonderful things to discover. And if you ask if I'm optimistic, in that regard, I'm very optimistic. I believe you can't convince me that that's not true. And I have never found it to be untrue that approaching each um, each person as this universe, as full of richness and complexity and wonderful stories. I mean, the even when the stories are kind of dark, um,
Yeah.
because I'm not a Pollyanna, and I know that there are people who are not my favorite people or who have selfish ill intent. I mean, I'm not naive at all.
Right.
But I feel like if you look at story as a truly universal value, then everyone has that. Even the darkest story is a story.
I love that. And what is amazing to me is you have always had this interest in this curiosity. It seems to have been the propulsive element for your entire career and your entire life. But speaking just in terms of your writing, you really honed your craft at those alternate weeklies that used to be so ubiquitous and so such a wonderful training ground for writers. But they don't, yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? And they don't exist anymore, as we well know, Susan. So I'm
Yeah.
just wondering about your thoughts about that. You're talking about a bygone era in some ways. And
It was really funny. When I finished the book, I suddenly realized that in a sense, it was a nostalgic journey through a bygone world. It was like visiting an old West town, where you think,
well, it's almost anthropological. This is the way it used to be, folks, in our culture.
and since it's my life, it was like, oh my God, I'm a living relic of an era. It really is. It 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 shocked me. Um, if I look at the number of places that I work for and how many are gone, that was really a kind of wistful
Yeah.
realization. Now, just to go back to the alternative news weeklies, it was a golden era. That
I love the fact on your Facebook profile you still have you worked at the Willamette Weekly.
I know, it's so funny. I mean, now it's 100 years ago, but it was, for someone like me who didn't want to be a newspaper reporter, and I had this highfalutin idea that I was going to write magazine pieces, long, exploratory, nonfiction
Yeah.
pieces. And, I was born at the right moment because when desktop publishing became a
Yeah.
reality,
Yeah.
suddenly there was a proliferation of alternative news weeklies all over that could publish inexpensively compared to the old
Right.
days of having a press.
The big printers, yeah.
Yeah, and there were alternative news weeklies really everywhere. I mean, very few cities of any size didn't have one.
At,
And
at least one in
yeah.
LA back in the day. We had several. You're talking to an alumni of the LA Reader. I too came up
Oh,
that way.
well, sure. And the Reader was a whole chain of
Chain
alternative
of.
news weekly. There's Chicago Reader and Baltimore Reader.
Mhm.
These were the ideal training ground for someone like me. They had journalistic rigor, but we weren't breaking news. We weren't chasing
Right.
the daily stories. And there was a freedom to have pieces that were long or longish anyway. There was also a kind of taste for individuality in the voice and the approach to stories. For me, it couldn't have been a more perfect fit. And I I want to emphasize, because I think it's sometimes lost in the shuffle, that journalism was very much at the heart of this. They weren't just like, I'm going to write a personal essay about,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I'm my toenail color. It was, these were journalistic stories, but
Or yeah, I was just going to say, or if they did lead with the toenail color, it became about the business of manicuring and
yeah,
the bigger story behind that. Everything was about the bigger context.
yeah, and it was a wonderful, and it was the first time that I began to feel that um, intuitive sense of this would be a good story. It's not obvious, it doesn't have breaking news or an obvious hook, but I just sense that this is a compelling, interesting story, that people will want to know this. I think if I had started my career at a newspaper, I wouldn't have had that chance early on to begin developing an instinct for what's a good story, what's a good, not obvious story. Because that's what we were doing. We were looking for good stories that were not obvious, that were, and that the approach could have voice as opposed to the more generic voice of a newspaper.
Well, you make the point very, very beautifully in the book that there is no such thing as objectivity. If you touch the thing, if you're observing the thing, you're changing the thing, and to use the old anthropological um, rule or conceit. And I think that what is so interesting in this book is that you not only talk about your life, but you talk about how your stories are interweaving with your life throughout.
Yes, and I believe entirely that pure objectivity just doesn't exist. And there are there are levels. I can understand how a newspaper story can show both sides and through great effort approach objectivity. But it can never actually be truly objective. But I also think what I learned working at alternative news weeklies is objectivity isn't necessarily the most important goal. Being true is an important goal
Yeah.
and
Yes.
an unnegotiable goal, but objectivity is a different thing than being accurate and being truthful. And I really embraced the subjectivity. It felt to me like I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story coming, filtering through me. I'm going to make every effort to be true and factual, but it's still my perspective.
Experience.
Yeah, and my experience and my humanly limited view of what's going on. And I feel like readers really understand that, and they're not pounding their fists saying, but wait a minute, and what about the other side?
Side.
That's not that's not the point here. It's not an argument. It's in a sense more documentary.
It's a
Um,
story. It's a story. You're
yeah,
saying, sit down, children, let me tell you a story about the one time this happened to me, or that
yeah,
I observed this orchid thief, the smartest man he knew, right?
yes, exactly. And that I also began to feel that people really yearned to have a companion in when they read. I'm their companion. I'm saying, oh wait, let's look over here. This looks interesting. And oh, then this happened and it threw me, I was surprised. And not that it's about me, but that I'm your friendly companion exploring this world with you. I don't think people read those stories and say, yeah, but wait a minute, this isn't objective. That's
Okay.
not the point. Everything I tell you, to the best of my knowledge, is factually true. And I'm very adamant about accuracy, being fact checkable. That's extremely important to me. But subjectivity is about the voice, and
Right.
frankly, it's about your relationship with the reader, that you're saying, we're in this
Yes.
together. Let me tell you about this adventure.
I just there's so much I want to talk to you about. I love the fact that you go into an interview, or you used to go into interviews without doing preparation because you wanted to have the experience of being educated in the process as the reader would be educated in the process. I loved that aspect.
It's funny because it sounds so, I think the story I wrote about the gospel group was a
Yes,
perfect example of that, where there's a lot of academic writing about gospel. Uh, and there's a whole body of work about it.
sure.
I felt like part of the story that I was writing involved diving into this very new world, and that I would learn about it through the people whose world it was. And if I needed to backfill and look up dates or look up names, or get historical reference, I could do that afterward.
After the fact.
Yeah, and I didn't. But also, as I said in the book, I think it's an important leveling of the playing field. I think reporters often make the mistake of coming in armed with all the knowledge and all of the background and all of the research, and it actually interferes with your ability to hear and be vulnerable. And frankly, I think it's good to be humbled a little and to say, look, I don't know anything about your world. Instead of saying, hey, I'm from the New Yorker. I've done 3 weeks of research on the history of gospel music, and you're wrong
Ah,
about the date you meant. I mean, that's
yeah,
not how you relate to people. How you relate to
yeah.
people is you say, your world is fascinating to me, and I know nothing about it. Teach me.
Teach me. I love, again, I could talk to you all day about this book and about everything you go into, but I know our time is limited. Um, I was amused that your dad always wanted you to go to law school, even after you'd gotten to the New Yorker. It was like you can always fall back on law school, Sue. You can always do that. So relatable.
Relentless, relentless. Well, as a writer, parents
Yeah.
have this total fear that like, if my son said to me, I want to be a writer,
You'd be like,
I would
whoa,
probably be
whoa.
like, go, maybe you should go to law school. Now that I'm a parent, I understand it completely. What I found funny is when there was concrete material
There
evidence that
evidence.
I was making, my
You're,
way as a writer, supporting myself, publishing books.
and you're at the apex of journalism, right?
What
you're
more
in
could
the
I do?
what could you do? And he's well, anyway. Uh
And I think at some point it became a little bit of a joke, but I mean, just I would tease him about it. But I think it was really hard for him to feel that I was just taking this risky path with no
yeah, security.
foundation that could give me security. And he was very much the product of the Depression, as was my mom. I think people who have gone through that experience are marked forever with this fear that everything could disappear in a minute.
Absolutely.
And of course, he's not wrong. It is a risky profession.
Yes.
I was determined, and I just felt like I'm going to make this work.
I want to talk about that determination because talk about it was almost like a Louis Hay book in some ways. You know, you envisioned early on the New Yorker, and by God, eventually you end up there. And it was through this relentless hard work and also the sense, this entrepreneurship that you talk about, that you need to be an entrepreneur as a writer. I think you really underscored that in detailing your career. And oh, go ahead.
Oh,
I'm going to
well,
finish.
I think it's something we don't talk about as writers, and it's going to be increasingly a reality because more and more writers are going to be freelance as the world, moves forward. The idea of a staff job is becoming rarer and rarer. And but also I feel like even if you've got a staff job, there's something very entrepreneurial about developing story ideas and
Constantly.
saying, these are the kinds of stories I want to do. I'm going to find them. I'm going to push to do them, as opposed to the passivity of saying, well, I'm here, assign me something. I never was like that. I always felt, well, I know what I want to do, so I just have to make it happen. Um, and also knowing how to navigate being self-employed. It's not, and even though I'm a staff writer in the New Yorker, I still am in a sense self-employed. I mean, I am
Well,
technically
I
self-employed.
wanted to ask you about that. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I love the fact you have a Substack. You wrote on Medium. You have these spin-off entrepreneurial aspects of your career. Can you talk a little bit about that and the particular moment that we're in as writers? And because I say to myself, even Susan Orlean has a Substack. You know, that is the nature of the world right now for
It
writers.
is. And I think that if you want to be a writer, you need to learn about these different channels and figure out what's going to work for you. I started my Substack partly because I wanted to, I think I'll back up. I think once I got off of Twitter, there was a
We
certain,
haven't even talked about Twitter and the epic COVID drunken tweets that are now part of history. But anyway, we can't cover everything. Go ahead. Once you got off of Twitter,
well, I think that I kind of yearned for a certain casual kind of writing that obviously my Substack is more evolved than tweeting, but
sure,
they both were they both have in common the sense that it was just me pressing publish, no, writing for the New Yorker is a very deliberate, careful, somewhat slow process. There's a lot of weight in making it,
sure.
it's a big deal. And I thought I just want to write for fun these little personal essays. And Substack felt, and I had written for Medium for a while where they specifically asked me to write about writing. And I did that for a year or two, I think, maybe 2 years. And I actually enjoyed it because I like teaching and I like that kind of conversation. Substack, though, was much more, I'm just going to have fun. I'm just going to write about stuff that interests me and just have it be my little diary that I'm sharing with the readers who choose to follow me there. And it's a lot of fun. I think we are in a Substack delusional mode in the world, which is everybody thinks, well, I'll start a Substack and make $1
Right.
million, and there will be a reckoning.
Yeah.
because it's just not, it doesn't work like that.
Right.
You do have the potential to make money, but it's a lot more work. If you want to make money, either you're already well known or you're going to have to work really hard. You're going to be running your own little magazine.
Right.
And while I think there will be a saturation. I think it's inevitable because I've had a few people say to me, I subscribe to 8 or 10 Substacks, and I suddenly realize I'm paying, $500 a year.
Right. And you could get 2 magazine subscriptions and a newspaper and support your local radio station for all of the above.
Right. And that it's not, the free subscription is certainly one aspect of it, but that means the creator is not making any money.
Right.
In which case you can treat it like Twitter, which is just having fun.
Yeah, exactly.
But as far as it being a replacement for employment at magazines and newspapers, I think we will reach a saturation, and it's just not possible for endless numbers of people to earn a salary by having a Substack.
I want to turn to something a little more personal, because you do write about some of the more painful elements of your life. You write about illness, you write about losing your parents, you write about one of the worst moments in a marriage, where your first book party for your first book, your husband at the time admitted he was having an affair right before you stepped into your book party. And there are so many painful moments that you also talk about. What was that like to write into, and what kind of perspective did perhaps putting the book together give you that you might not have had if you hadn't tackled them directly?
It was pretty painful to write. I feel like I had more or less grown well past the point of thinking a lot about my first marriage, and then suddenly I was returning to writing about it, and that was sobering. I was writing some of it when I was at a writer's residency, so I was away from home, and I was really melancholy. I mean, it was not easy to revisit some of those stories, and
Sure.
yet it felt genuine to the purpose of the book to
Sure.
to track my life in parallel to my work. And look, it was also in a somewhat unexplicit, but I think obvious way, a statement about men having trouble with women and their success.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, this happened more than once, and I began thinking, you've got to be kidding. I mean, the obviousness of this is almost like you're too smart to be being so obvious and so it's just such a cliche.
Right.
But it was still very painful to think about, and also I was self-conscious. I felt like I'm not here to kind of rage against my ex-husband or say he was a bad guy, he was a horrible guy, look, he did this to me, he did that to me, but rather maybe give you understand what track my personal life was on, because I'm spelling out very explicitly the track that my professional life was on, and the challenge that was.
Well, that was so much to the beauty of the book. Really, literally, I had to stop underlining. I'm not exaggerating, Susan. I am not exaggerating. The fact that you, this icon among journalists, really you are, and I hope you can absorb that. You really are. You were dealing with infidelity, you were dealing with insecurity, you were dealing with Tina Brown, the famous editor of the Vanity Fair who took over the New Yorker, and that destabilizing idea of her calling and you never knowing whether she was going to fire you or whether she was going to compliment you. I love that vulnerability is very appealing in this work.
Well, it was very, I mean, I will say I feel the book really was pretty naked about the the challenges that have been part. I mean, I've had a incredibly fortunate life, and overall I would say, wow, I am the luckiest girl in the world. And but I also
Joyride.
felt that there was a lot to say about, and certainly working for Tina as an example, in many ways it was unbelievable. And I have great fondness towards her. And once she figured me out, she was amazing. But I couldn't handle the kind of pressure that I think she
Yeah,
sees it as a management technique that you keep people always off balance
on
and
balance.
always feeling like if I don't do a better story next time, I'm going to get fired. And it gets really good work out of you. It's a very hard way to live.
Yeah.
I happen to think that you can apply as much motivational pressure on people without making them so crazy. But and I think David Remnick is a good example of someone who expects great things, and he's not the old school New Yorker editor who says, you have a
Just for our
deadline.
audience who might not know, David Remnick is the current editor of the New Yorker, who's
Right, and who
much
took over after
from
Tina
Tina
left.
Brown.
And, the early days of the New Yorker, the total lack of deadline, the total lack of budget, for some people, it was bliss. And for a lot of people, it was, as I said, it's like not giving your kids boundaries.
Right.
There were people who would take years and years and years to write one piece because they
Well,
had no deadline.
the writer that you mentioned, I don't remember his name because he wasn't on my radar, but he'd written two stories in 28 years or something
Yeah,
to the effect. Yeah.
yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, look, no story is ever perfect. We all know that there is no such thing as a perfect story, and that you can iterate endlessly on any piece of creative work. It's a given. There is no metric
Right.
for
No piece of
perfection.
writing, as someone once told me, no piece of writing is ever finished. It's only abandoned. And I always
Right.
think of that.
Right. And it's true. And at some point it's your deadline and you say, well, I've worked as hard as I can. This is as good as I can get it. There will always be tweaks that I'm going to want
Tweaks.
to do. But to not have a deadline, my first piece for the New Yorker, when I asked for the deadline and my editor said, well, there's no deadline. And I said, well, no, you've got to
I,
give me a deadline. Like,
yeah.
just, he said, well, what do you want for your deadline? And I named a date that was generous, but in the foreseeable future. And I said, how about, July 15th? He said, okay, your deadline is July 15th. And I thought, this is why people go crazy here.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I want a fair deadline, but I absolutely want a
Need
deadline.
a right. My mom used to say nothing clears your head like a good hanging in the morning. So,
Right, right. And there is um I think psychologically it's very helpful to have a reachable goal, a concrete, specific, And this is, well, as I wrote in the book, when I started giving myself daily word counts, it came to be the most important tool for me to say, no, I'm not writing my whole book today. Don't think about that. I'm
Right.
writing
Just
1,000 words
just
today.
get the words.
And then I can look at a calendar and say, if I write 1,000 words every day, I will finish my book October 1st.
Right.
It's a huge relief rather than sitting down in front of the computer and thinking, I have to write 100,000 words. I'm going to go play with the dog. Because you're absolutely defeated. I mean, when I ran
Right.
the marathon, I ran it mile by mile. I and someone had said to me the day before the marathon, "Do you want to drive the route?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I don't want to see how far away it
Um,
is. I'm just
yeah.
1 mile, then the next mile, then the next mile." And I think there's a lot of psychology and creativity and a lot of need for some some tools to help you be free enough to be creative and to be artful and write beautifully, but you need tools to make it possible.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, and then I promise I'll let you go after this question and then a last question. But I was so interested to learn toward the end of the book that you actually asked a fellow journalist to interview you for this memoir. Can you talk about that experience and why that choice?
As I was working on the book, I thought, I feel like I don't know how to do this. I know how to write about other people. So what is it that I need? And I thought, well, what do I do when I'm doing like the
Right,
library? Well, my very first thing is I begin interviewing the people who are important. Now, our memories are all whatever they are, but it dawned on me that I needed to have what was in my memory kind of out on the page,
right,
and that doing it in that formal relationship being questioned was going to be the tool that would help me, get the data from this place onto a page.
right.
It was incredibly helpful, and it made me begin looking at myself as a subject, which
Oh,
was
interesting.
very important for writing the book. I thought,
Yeah.
oh, here's this interesting subject, Susan Orlean. Um, what's she all about? Where did she grow up? What were her parents like? And it sounds funny.
No, it's great.
It
Yeah.
really unlocked it got me into the relationship with the subject that I needed to have, which was I'm observing this interesting subject that I'm going to tell you about, this writer, Susan, who I know a little. And now we're going to interview her for the sake of the story. It really, I mean, I know a lot of people find it a very odd idea.
I
Uh,
loved
but
it though.
it was great. It was great. And as I mentioned in the book, I didn't sit there quoting directly from the transcripts. I think as an exercise, it allowed me to shift my posture into looking at myself as an interesting subject. And that was what I needed to write the book.
I
I
think
needed
that's
that little, not full arm's length, but
just a little bit of perspective, a little bit of
yes,
stepping back.
yeah.
And yet the tone of this memoir is very much as if you're sitting across the kitchen table having a cup of coffee, just telling me directly all about the ins and outs of your career and your love life and your parents. And it has that kind of intimacy that I think probably, well, your work is always intimate that way, but this one in particular feels.
Well, that was exactly what I was trying to get to, which was Uh, I always like a tone that feels conversational and intimate. This felt like it was essential to say, we're friends. Let me, my first marriage was really difficult. Let me tell you about that. But also coincidentally, I was working on this story and the way I went at it was XYZ. Um, and that was I think sometimes when I'm writing, I need to have an image in my mind of me talking to the reader. In this case, it was, oh, we're in my house, sitting at my kitchen table, as opposed to I'm in Jackson, Mississippi,
Right.
sitting at a gospel singer's kitchen
Kitchen.
table or a
Right.
10-year-old boy's breakfast table.
Table.
We're in my house, in my table. And that helped me very much in finding my voice. I think memoirs are the ultimate exercise of voice. And you get it right or you get it wrong. And it mattered a lot to me. It took a long time to think, okay, I think I got it.
Well, as a memoir instructor, as you know, for many years, I give you an A+ on this.
Oh, well, thank you. I
Is
accept.
is there anything we haven't talked about? I could literally talk to you for the next 3 hours about this book. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you really want to say to
Oh,
our
no, I
audience?
feel like we've really ranged far and wide and I think really talked about the essence of what the book is about because it's both very much about writing, but it's very personal.
It
So,
is.
and I'm glad we've kind of touched on both.
Well, I loved it. Everyone, run, do not walk to your bookseller to get Joyride, Susan Orlean. Susan, thank you so much. And I hope we get a chance to talk about this again. And I hope we get that cup of coffee in real time at
Me
some
too.
point.
We need to go for horseback ride, Sam.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm
I will
serious.
absolutely make that. Okay, we'll make it
All right,
happen. Okay,
done.
girl. Bye.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so
much.
much. Such a pleasure.
Next
Love you.
time. Love you. Bye. Well, that's it for tonight, folks. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks Susan and Gardner as well for being our guests. Also, thanks to our magician behind the scenes, our production manager, Julie Corlett. Couldn't do it without her. If you have thoughts you'd like to share from today, or if you have additional questions, please email us at events@scng.com. If you want to give me suggestions directly on the show, reach me at sdunn@scng.com. Bookish will, of course, be back next month with a great lineup of two authors whose books I swear are going to keep you on the edge of your seat. Thriller author Patricia Cornwell and memoirist Karen Palmer. Meanwhile, you'll find great coverage, as always, on books in our newspapers every day and online at all our sites, and also in our Book Pages newsletter. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you next time.